Next from Springfield, we talk one-on-one with Canadian Consul General Gitane De Silva. Trade with Canada creates some 300,000 Illinois jobs. In fact, Illinois does more trade with Alberta Canada than with any state in the Union. We'll hear why the Consul General was in Springfield to call on Illinois lawmakers. This runs about 20 minutes.
Gitane De Silva, Canadian Consul General. Welcome again to the Illinois Channel.
Thank you very much. Nice to be back.
And welcome to Springfield. I understand this is your first visit to Springfield?
Yes, it is. It's a beautiful city. We're hoping to get out and see the sights a bit while we're here. What
is on your agenda? What brings you to the city?
We have a busy time, actually. We're here to talk to people about why Canada is important for Illinois. So we're doing some outreach at the Capitol. I'll be addressing both the House and the Senate, meeting with the leadership there, and also speaking with the Illinois Petroleum Council and doing some outreach at a couple of universities. So it's a busy few days.
I know before we had talked, and I'll repeat for the viewers, a couple of statistics that really underscores the relationship between Canada and Illinois, and a couple of them I just found shocking. They were, I never would have imagined. One is that Canada or Illinois, I should say, does more trade with Canada than it does with any state in the nation.
That's right.
And actually, specifically, Alberta.
Mm-hmm. No, it is staggering.
And that Canada does 3 times as much trade with Illinois as it does with the country of Mexico.
Yeah, that's right, actually, and Illinois trades more with Canada than you do with your next 5 largest trading partners combined. So it is quite staggering when you think of, we have 33 million people in Canada, and we buy more from you than China and India and the 3 billion people that live there. So it is quite astonishing.
I know we buy from you, among other things, oil, the oil sands up in Alberta, mm-hmm. and that brings us to one of the issues that we've been hearing about as Americans on a national level, the Keystone Pipeline. Mm-hmm. That is required to bring that down from Alberta to various refineries. Mm-hmm. Tell us, what is the position of the Canadian government on the Keystone Pipeline?
Well, we really see our oil sands as a strategic resource, not only for Canada, but for the United States and for North America. Canada has the 3rd largest proven oil reserves in the world. 98% of our reserves are in the oil sands. Canada is the #1 supplier of foreign oil to the United States. 27%, in fact, of the foreign oil that the U.S. buys comes from Canada, which is more than twice what you buy from Saudi Arabia or Venezuela. So it is a very important relationship. We do respect the U.S. process and understand that, there are decisions to be made. We do hope that in the end the pipeline will be approved. So we're watching the process closely. Nebraska has now moved forward. The governor there has approved the new route. So now we're waiting for the State Department process to unfold and the U.S. interagency process, and we're hopeful that in the end the pipeline will be approved.
Is the Canadian government involved in the financing of the Keystone Pipeline?
No, it's entirely a private project. It's a Trans-Canada pipeline, and they're funding it entirely. We just, from our perspective, feel that it's important for North American energy security and for economic competitiveness. 1 in 23 jobs in the United States depends on trade with Canada, and there's over 300,000 jobs here in the state of Illinois that depend on trade with Canada. And it's estimated that by 2035, an additional $15 billion a year could be added to U.S. GDP if oil sands production continues. So obviously it's an important issue not only for Canada, but for the United States.
And I remember the Arab oil embargo of 1973, and mm-hmm. President Nixon then saying that a goal of the United States ought to be energy independent. Mm-hmm. I think virtually everyone is surprised, even people perhaps in the oil industry, that with the fracking that's been going on, the production of natural gas, mm-hmm. the oil sands that have come online, not really all that long ago, I don't mm-hmm. think, that certainly when we combine our production of oil and gas along with what Canadians are producing and can bring into mm-hmm. our refineries, we might really, at least in North America, be energy independent. Mm-hmm.
Well, I heard a stat just this morning that 71% of the oil the United States consumes comes from NAFTA, the 3 NAFTA countries. So that is very impressive and certainly much larger proportion than it was in the past. And the combination of U.S. domestic increased oil production with Canadian increased production, I think we're certainly on a very positive trajectory.
Now, we talked about the oil and how Illinois is, by the way, one of the largest refining states. People may or may not know that, and so we can use the Canadian oil. A lot of the Illinois pipe fitters I know are currently working at the Whiting refinery just across the line in Indiana, mm-hmm. and again, so that they can handle the oil sands crude. Mm-hmm. But beyond that, what is it that Illinois produces that is being sent up to Canada, and again, that is part and parcel of that 300,000 jobs that is tied to trade with Canada.
Yeah. Well, there's a number of companies in Illinois that provide either goods or services to the oil sands. A very big one is Caterpillar. Where they're based in Peoria, we buy a lot of mining equipment from Cat, a whole variety of trucks and shovels and things. They have a whole line, in fact, that they've developed and produced just for the oil sands because of the magnitude of the size of the project. So that's one. There's Convergent Technologies, which is in Schaumburg, and they produce a system that has security controls for some of the production assets in the oil sands. So there's a whole wide variety. There's about 1,000 US companies based in every state across the country that provide services or supplies to the oil sands.
Now, we mentioned you're here in Springfield. You're going to be calling on some of the lawmakers during your trip here. Tell us a little bit, because I think people forget how many consulates there are in the Chicago area. What is your mission here in Illinois, and how much of it's not just Illinois you call on, how many states do you actually serve out of the consulate?
I just cover 3, Wisconsin, Illinois, and Missouri. And we, in fact, have 12 consulates general. Canada has 12 consulates general across the U.S., plus our embassy in Washington. So we have a pretty big presence. The only country that has more offices in the United States is Mexico, and they're focused more on immigration and consular issues. And we focus in large part on trade and political relations. So our purpose really is to advance Canada's interests here in the Midwest. And we're fortunate that often Canada's interests and the Midwest's interests are the same. So when we see increased energy production in Canada, that helps the Midwest. It means jobs on both sides of the border. So we're talking to people about all these things, about, you know, trade with Canada last year was almost $700 billion, or $1.2 million per minute every second of every day. You have hundreds of thousands of people that cross the border every day. You have all these family and people-to-people ties. So we're just reminding people really about the importance of Canada, not only in terms of the energy relationship, but the overall relationship, and then even things like agriculture and other sectors as well. Our whole economy is very highly integrated. So we talk to people about the legislation that they're working on and reminding them that, you know, when you're thinking of issues, if you're looking at protectionist measures, perhaps targeted against India or China, that you have to be careful that Canada doesn't get caught up in that, because obviously if you do something that closes off an avenue for Canada, it does have an economic impact here in the Midwest as well.
Excuse me. Speaking of China, wasn't there just a deal recently that Chinese bought, what is it, a large Canadian, is it oil producer? Is it?
That's right. There was a recent deal that was concluded, the CNOOC-Nexen deal, where a Chinese entity wanted to buy a controlling interest in an oil sands company, and that was approved. But it was made very clear that that was approved. Canada has changed its Foreign Investment Act, and that proposal was submitted under the old act. And so it's been made very clear that going forward, things will be different. Canada is open for business. We're open for investment. We encourage foreign investment, but we're not keen on having our natural resources controlled by a foreign government. And that's really the big difference.
Is there a danger relative to the Keystone Pipeline? And I just heard Ambassador Gary Dewar, a Canadian ambassador, talking on the radio and saying, you know, Canada wants to sell its oil to the United States. Yeah. I think it goes without saying that we have the United States and Canada really the closest relationship, as we've talked in the past. I think so close that sometimes we almost forget there's a border or a difference between our nations. But that also Ambassador Dewar was saying, you know, but ultimately if the United States doesn't take our oil, we're going to sell it to others. Right now the President, the White House is weighing the decision on the Keystone Pipeline. If for whatever reason they turn that down, is there another alternative that we might be able to get the oil, or if it's turned down at that point, has the door closed to trade with the United States on that oil, and you're just going to be looking abroad? Well,
we can't proceed with the pipeline without a presidential permit because it crosses the border. So if the president were to deny the request for a permit, that pipeline could not proceed. It does not mean that another pipeline application down the road would not be approved, but that pipeline cannot go forward without a presidential permit. But Canada does have the 3rd largest proven oil reserves in the world. We are a nation of only 33 million people, so we have much more oil we can produce than we will consume. Oil is a global commodity traded on the international market, so if there is a demand, we will look to fulfill that demand. Of course, geographically, it's much easier if the oil comes here, and given the interconnectedness of our pipeline infrastructure and everything else, it just makes sense. But if that pipeline doesn't get built, there is talk, and Canada is moving forward right now with plans to negotiate and build a pipeline from Alberta to the West Coast to potentially ship oil to Asia that way. And there are discussions as well about shipping oil from Alberta to the East Coast to ship it across to Asia from the other side.
How much time do we have? How long can Canada wait?
Well, production is increasing daily, and right now, oil is finding other ways across the border. Lots of oil comes over right now in rail cars. There is a demand there. The refineries have the capacity, and we're looking to fulfill that need. So it is far safer to ship oil by pipeline than by rail car. So we would like to see the pipeline built. It is a project. It is a major infrastructure project, so it will take some time to come to completion once approved. But I would say that the Trans-Canada pipeline, the KXL pipeline, is far further advanced than either the other pipeline proposals in Canada.
There's certain issues I know you're engaged in, others I'm going to ask some. I don't know if you're engaged in or not, but speaking of rail cars, and you're in the Chicago area right now to the consulate, it's well known the Chicagoland freight rail yard is extremely congested, and is that something that you at all get engaged in, or the Canadian government is concerned about as far as just the transportation of goods and services on rail through the Chicagoland area?
Yeah, well, Chicago is obviously a very important logistics hub, intermodal, and CN, in fact, is a Canadian company, though they are much more North American and international now with their presence in Chicago. They're the largest Canadian employer in Illinois, actually, or the second largest after BMO Harris. And so we do work with CN on issues, and certainly if Canadian companies are having challenges in terms of distribution, we'll work on that. The biggest infrastructure or transportation issue we're focused on in the moment is actually trying to have a second bridge built between Windsor and Detroit. Currently there's the Ambassador Bridge, which is arguably the most important border crossing in the world. The volumes of trade, dollar-wise, are astonishing that cross that bridge every day. And right now there's just the one bridge. Canada's been negotiating with the United States for years to build a second one, both to increase capacity, because right now the waits for trucks at the border are quite considerable, and also for redundancy. If there's an issue on the bridge, if something breaks, if there's a threat against it, that has a huge impact for just-in-time delivery and manufacturing on both sides of the border. So we've been working for years and negotiating with the state of Michigan to get that bridge built. There was an agreement signed last year between Canada and the state of Michigan to proceed with the bridge, and Canada has agreed, in fact, to fund the bridge in its entirety in order to make sure that the bridge gets built. And then we will have a revenue sharing whereby there will be tolls charged, and until the Canadian government is repaid, all the money will go to Canada, after which there'll be a different formula. So that's really our big priority, is to get that second bridge built, and we're hopeful that we can get through the federal approvals process and move forward and start building soon.
When one, and this is a good time I think to bring up, when one travels to Canada, it used to be really just like almost going into another state. These days, if one's going to go to Canada, you need to have a passport, is that right?
You don't actually need a passport to go to Canada, you need a passport to get back into the United States.
Okay.
So in Canada, you need proof of identity and proof of citizenship, which can be a combination of a driver's license and a birth certificate. But a few years ago, the United States introduced something called the Western Hemisphere Travel Initiative. It used to be that Canada and a few Caribbean countries were exempt from the need for a passport if a U.S. citizen traveled there, but they changed that a few years ago, and now it is if you travel to Canada or a few other countries, you do need a passport to get back into the United States.
I want to move a little bit to some more economic issues aside from energy that we talked about. Just here in Illinois this week, some lawmakers proposed what they call a pro-growth policy, legislative policy, and one of it was to basically cut the red tape. If there are businesses, and obviously Illinois has quite a lot of businesses, large and small, if there are businesses that want to sell their wares or goods to Canada, would they go through your consulate, and to what extent is it a cumbersome process, how much red tape, or not?
Well, our role is really to facilitate the way for Canadian businesses looking to export into the United States, and then we encourage U.S. companies to invest or expand their investments into Canada. If there's Illinois companies that are looking to sell to Canada, then they would deal with the Illinois Department of Commerce. So that's not a role that we really play, but we can certainly point them in the right direction. One thing that is of interest to businesses, though, is that we are working on, in December of last year, or the year before actually, 2011, Prime Minister Harper and President Obama announced the Beyond the Border Action Plan, which is focused on facilitating the the movement of legitimate trade and travelers across the border while pushing the perimeter out and the risk out as far as possible. So basically letting the good guys through and keeping the bad guys out. And there's 32 points on this action plan, which are working towards a number of things to basically make the border work better. In parallel to that, there's a regulatory initiative where there are specific sectors that our two governments are targeting, and we're looking at issues whereby we can facilitate trade. So one example is, say you're looking to import or export a fridge. It could be that you have to file papers with 9 different government agencies in order to have that happen. So we're looking to streamline those types of processes. Or one example that's often used is that the legislation that was written in the United States for baggage screening specifically lists one type of equipment that has to be used. On the Canadian side, it's a standard. And so when it comes to pre-clearance for people moving back and forth across the border, it causes an issue. So we're working to move together to have a comparable standard as opposed to saying just this one specific piece of equipment in order to facilitate trade and travel.
When you go around to your various meetings, again, you're here, but of course you call on any number of places. What are either the major points that you're trying to make? We probably covered some of those, but what are some of the misconceptions that you try to overcome?
I think people are often surprised that Canada is Illinois' and the United States' #1 trading partner. They don't really understand the magnitude of the relationship. I think they're very surprised often to find that Canada is the #1 supplier of all forms of energy, including oil. I think there is a very strong willingness to work together. I think the fact that we have such deep, often personal ties, you know, a lot of people have Canadian heritage, they honeymooned in Canada, they worked in Canada, whatever it is, so we have a common culture, belief in democracy and rule of law, these sorts of things. So there is a real willingness to work together, so there is an openness, and people are looking for opportunities. When you tell people that U.S. exports to Canada increased by 12% from 2010 to 2011, that really makes them sit up and take notice that, you know, Illinois has a plan to double its exports. And it's great to look to diversify your markets. Every country around the world is doing that. But when you have one big partner and things are going well, it's important to pay attention to that too.
In fact, I honeymoon in Canada. It's a beautiful, beautiful country.
It is. Yes, I might be biased, but it is.
Let me just turn to also the economy. Everyone in Illinois is worried about the economy. Nationally, we're worried about the economy, the U.S. economy. How is the Canadian, how is your economy doing? And how is your issue with either entitlements or debt? I think you have probably a cleaner balance sheet than what we in the United States may have.
Well, we're fortunate. We did go through a credit downgrade in the early 90s, and that made us really, you know, sit up and take notice and decide to make a concerted effort to put our financial house in order. So we made some very difficult decisions in the early 90s about programs to cut and what we were going to fund and how to tax. That enabled us to, it took us 10 years, but we did get our AAA credit rating back. We are very blessed in Canada with natural resources, so that has helped us. And we also have had very strict and continue to have very strict banking regulations, which helped us to weather the financial downturn better than some other countries. We've been impacted like everybody else, but we've been fortunate that we're not in as serious a position as some other countries. So we're continuing to improve, and we certainly hope that the U.S. economy does as well, as because, you know, you are our #1 trading partner too. So what's good for you is good for us too.
We often talk about the long, expansive border that we share with Canada. Of course, one of the other things is not just a land connection, but our sharing of the Great Lakes. I just heard the other day, interestingly, that Lake Michigan, the water level, I think, is lower than it has been in quite some time. To what extent is Canada and the United States, do we work together as far as maintaining the environmental quality and the shipping lanes within on the Great Lakes?
Well, it's certainly a big issue for us. I think it's very telling of the nature of our relationship that we're able to jointly manage 20% of the world's fresh water and to do so without ever going to war over it. I think there's very few countries that could say the same. So one of the oldest treaties between Canada and the United States is actually the Boundary Waters Treaty, which was signed back in 1909. And that sets out a path and established something called the International Joint Commission, which governs how we use these waters that we share. And it looks at issues of water quantity and water quality, you know, the commercial uses, the safe drinking water, all these kinds of issues. And we actually just back in September of last year announced or re-signed a renewed Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. And the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement has 10 annexes in it, which address specific issues like chemicals of mutual concern, invasive species, partnering on scientific research. So it really is a joint resource that we look to manage together. We work on issues like decreasing the levels of toxics, issues of, you know, toxic like algae, zebra mussels, all these kinds of things, because obviously invasive species don't recognize a border, and Asian carp is one U.S. export that we're not looking to import into Canada. So we have been very proactive on it and working together, and we have had a series of great successes. If you look at the number of areas of concern in the Great Lakes now compared to 20 years ago, we've decreased that number substantially. So we'll continue to work on that and continue to focus, because we do want the Great Lakes to be a useful resource and a healthy resource for generations to come.
All right, well, Gitane De Silva, thank you again for joining us. Welcome to Springfield. Good luck on your mission here, and thank you again for joining us on the Illinois Channel.
Thank you for your time. Thank you.
You're watching the Illinois Channel, an independent nonprofit corporation formed to provide gavel-to-gavel coverage of Illinois state government and other public affairs events taking place across Illinois.